Hello and welcome. In this video, we'll go through the details of how to answer the Vouchers for Disabilities affirmative. First, we'll go over the parts of the affirmative, from inherency and solvency through the advantages. We'll talk about some terms available in the evidence packet, discuss how to use off-case arguments, and then walk through how to answer the affirmative speech by speech. As a reminder, affirmative cases have several important parts. The inherency, which is why the problem exists now, the plan, which is what the federal government should do about it, the solvency, which describes how the plan will work, and the advantages, the reasons why we should do the plan. The affirmative must argue that their plan is a good idea, having advantages, and that it has solvency, or that it will work. Defensive arguments against solvency and to take out advantages can be helpful, but ultimately, offensive arguments answering the question, why not try, are also needed in order to win the debate on the negative. Let's talk about inherency. The affirmative will argue that students with disabilities are not being served well by existing public school programs. In this file, there are multiple arguments that suggest existing mechanisms that allow students with disabilities to receive a quality education exist now. There are even some arguments that show how students with disabilities can receive federal funding to attend private schools now to better serve their disabilities. On solvency, the affirmative will argue that vouchers can be a good idea, at least for students with disabilities. They identify a state program, the McKay Scholarship Program out of Florida, to use as a model for their affirmative. The negative has an array of options, most aggressively saying that public schools are better and have more resources for students with disabilities, and that vouchers are bad and encourage the misdiagnosis of disability. Let's talk about the poverty advantage. It's hard to argue against poverty. It's generally not a good idea to argue that poverty is good or that it doesn't exist now. You're just not going to win those arguments. However, there are ways to contest the substance of their advantage. Individuals with disabilities might disproportionately end up in poverty, but is education the solution? Does it ignore some key factors that prevent them from solving, like transportation issues? On the human rights advantage, this is pretty straightforward. If education is a human right, then they get the advantage. Therefore, the negative has evidence to contest whether education is a human right or it's a privilege that one gets by living in an advanced society. Let's talk about turns. A turn is an offensive argument against the affirmative that you can use on case. This file contains a few arguments that help you gain some leverage against the affirmative. The legal protections turn discusses how voucher programs require students with disabilities to give up their legal rights in exchange for financial rewards. The voucher expansion turn argues that voucher programs for disabilities never stay limited to students with disabilities and lead to an expansion of vouchers for all. This lets you make more generic vouchers are bad arguments, and it also gives you a greater link to off-case arguments. The achievement gap turn discusses how vouchers increase the achievement gap instead of decreasing it, encouraging poverty and social stratification for those who don't get it. Off-case arguments are an incredibly useful part of the negative arsenal. Let's talk about the spending disadvantage. First, it's important to establish a specific link, and this being the key to winning this argument. Educating students with disabilities is generally more expensive than educating students without disabilities. Vouchers may also remove money from the public school system and send it to the private sector. You could also argue that concentrating students with disabilities in public schools allows them to share resources like specialists and teaching materials, which is cheaper overall. Once you've established a link, you'll have to win a framework argument that we should care about the outcomes of the trade-off, like terrorism or disease, etc., versus the human rights and moral claims of the affirmative. Let's talk about topicality, the other off-case option in the novice toolbox. Any of the three topicality violations can be used against this affirmative. Topicality is substantial. The program doesn't impact that many students, and it doesn't spend that much money comparatively, so you shouldn't have to debate it. This is a winnable argument, and topicality substantial can also help you win a link to the spending disadvantage. if they make we meet arguments that the plan is expensive and substantial in order to avoid your topicality argument, you can use their words against them on the spending disadvantage to prove a link. Topicality increase versus create. The plan creates a new program versus expanding an existing one, so it's plausible that we shouldn't have to debate it. Topicality education. This argument defines education as curriculum, graduation or enrollment requirements, and setting up schools. Since vouchers are a funding mechanism, you might be able to win that this should be outside the resolution. Let's talk about how to use all these arguments throughout a debate and win rounds on the negative. First, let's talk about the 1NC. It's important to have a coherent plan going into this speech, and not just to start reading random cards from the evidence packet. Reading one of the spending disadvantages, a topicality argument, and some combination of turns and solvency or inherency attacks against the affirmative is a sound strategy for the 1NC. A diverse 1NC strategy gives you more options later in the debate. In the block, remember to divide and conquer. Each debater should address different arguments in their speeches. For example, the 2NC could take the spending disadvantage and case, while the 1NR took topicality. Or, the 2NC could take case, and the 1NR could take the spending disadvantage, kicking topicality. First, outline your position, and make sure to answer all 2AC arguments. Lastly, make sure to add offense. The more arguments you can make in the block, the harder it is to answer everything in the first affirmative rebuttal. In the 2NR, it's important to choose one coherent group of arguments to go for. Here are some examples. Just the spending disadvantage, just topicality, the spending disadvantage and solvency takeouts, or inherency, solvency, and offensive case turns. Please note, you can't go for topicality and any other case position. Topicality is an all or nothing proposition. It's important to tell the story of your negative position, so have an overview about how your arguments work together. Next, answer any 1AR arguments the affirmative made against the arguments you're still talking about, and make sure to answer any offense. Lastly, be sure to do impact calculus and answer framework. Why should the judge care about your impacts, and why are they more important than the affirmative impacts and morality claims? It's helpful to use time frame, probability, and magnitude to enhance your analysis. In the JV division, the plan text of the affirmative case must remain the same and predictable for the negative. This means that all of your answers will still work, but they might have new reasons to support the plan or additional solvency research. However, you too can do new research to improve your arguments and add new scenarios. New solvency or inherency arguments can show how the affirmative is unneeded or won't work. New advantage answers can get rid of their offense or destroy their framework claims. New turns can add offense for the negative, and new links to off-case arguments will make it easier to bring those arguments into the debate.